Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Frontline Club. I'm Faisal Yafai. This is Lydia Wilson, as most of you know. Once again, thank you for joining us for the second season of our events program. We're here to talk about a particular book, which we'll get to in a moment. But through the book, we are really talking about the situation in Syria today. And to a large degree, Syria has fallen off the front pages and the news agenda. The Arab governments have started the process of normalizing. The war in Ukraine has shifted the focus, of course, away from the Middle East. But for people inside Syria, as many of you who have worked on Syria will know, the war never really came to an end. There is still a mass internal repression of the population. And the way that this repression is carried out, which is what we're going to talk about today, is through the prison system. The prison system in Syria fulfills multiple roles. It functions as a warning to anyone who wants to oppose the regime. It is used to eliminate, through incarceration and torture, political opponents of the regime, and it's used to frighten and cow into submission the majority of the population. The book we are here to discuss, Syrian Gulag, Inside Assad's Prison System, is the first comprehensive overview of that system. And it's written by two people who have detailed knowledge of the experience of being in Assad's jails. We had originally intended to have one of the authors, Jaber Bakr, here. However, he hasn't been able to make it to London. Instead, we have Uğur Üngör on the line. Do we still say that? On the camera, on the Zoom, from Amsterdam. Uğur is the professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam, and the NOID, Institute of War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. His main area of interest is the history and sociology of mass violence, with a particular focus on the modern and contemporary Middle East. He's won several academic awards and held visiting positions in Dublin, Vancouver, Budapest, Toronto, Los Angeles, and Edinburgh. Uğur Üngör, welcome to the Frontline.
Thank you.
So, as Faisal just mentioned, the book we're here to discuss is actually the very first comprehensive, detailed look at the whole system of incarceration in Syria. Uğur, can you start by explaining why now? Why is it possible, in a way it hasn't been possible before, to do this, to do your work?
Well, hello everyone. Good evening, and thank you for the kind invitation. I'm substituting for Jaber, who was unable to make it to London in person. So the story, the backstory of the book is that Jaber Bakr and I, we met in 2017 when he was presenting one of his previous books, namely on the memoirs of a survivor of Hospital 601, which is a hospital close to the Damascus military airport, where possibly thousands of people have been tortured and killed. And that was the focus of the infamous Caesar photos. One of the survivors of that prison/hospital happened to live in Amsterdam, and Jaber interviewed him, wrote a book about it. And during that book presentation, which was here in Amsterdam, I met him. That was for the first time in 2017, December. And we started talking. We have common interests, of course, in studying state violence in Syria. And I asked him a very simple question. Why is it that this regime has been around for almost 50 years, and yet there's not a single overview book, short or long, on its vast prison system, which has affected so many people? And his answer was basically it wasn't possible to do that type of research for a number of reasons. But after 2011, the possibilities opened up. Mainly because a large number of survivors and eyewitnesses of the prisons went abroad and felt safe enough to speak about their experiences, their terrible experiences in these prisons. And Jaber had already been interviewing these former detainees. And in total, at that moment, we decided to continue our conversations, and our conversations then gradually led into a plan if there's no such book, then let's make that book. And that took a while. It was 2017, now it's 2023. The book already came out in Dutch last year, and this is the English version. And it's basically because many survivors are abroad now and are willing and able to talk. They're relatively safe also to be interviewed. Jaber himself conducted over 100 interviews. I myself have interviewed about 50. And together, that paints a picture, and these kind of collective biographies, they're sufficient, actually, more than sufficient to paint a picture of this horrible system.
And can you then explain the title you ended up with, Syria's Gulags? You know, that you're taking it from a very different context, that of the Russian Gulags. Can you explain why you landed on that title?
Yes, but the institute where I work happens to have one of the experts on the Soviet Gulag. One of the top experts happens to be a colleague of mine. And when I told her about the project Jabir and I were about to embark on, she advised us to look into conceptual and theoretical discussions on the Soviet Gulag. And we did. We did some kind of common reading. I was already interested in Stalinism. So at some point we realized that just Syria's prisons doesn't cut it. You know, because every country has prisons. I mean, I live in the Netherlands. We have prisons. You could write a book, Dutch prisons. But you wouldn't say Dutch Gulag. But why not? Because for a number of reasons that we explain in the book. Basically because for two main reasons. One is that the Soviet Gulag served to imprison political detainees, political dissidents. So not necessarily people who've committed kind of ordinary crimes, stealing, theft, murder, driving through a red light, insulting a police officer, not those type of things, but, for example, putting a like on Facebook of a post that's critical of President Assad, or starting a discussion in university about that there should be more democracy in Syria. So, or demonstrating basically in the streets. So, much like in the Soviet Gulag, the overwhelming majority of the prisoners and detainees are political. That's one main reason. And the second main reason is that just like in the Soviet Gulag, the prison system has a disproportionate impact on Soviet and also on Syrian society. So to give you an example, in the UK has prisons, the Netherlands has prisons, Germany has prisons, and most people don't think about these prisons a lot, unless they happen to have maybe a family member who landed in prison. But in Syria, that's not the case. The prison system looms large, always in the background. It's always potentially there. You're always one remark and one comment away from being in a horrific place like Saydnaya. You're always one Facebook post, one denunciation away from being in the torture dungeons of the Assad regime. So even for those people who are not in prison, the system looms large. And so it has a disproportionate impact in the society. And this is the reason why we chose to use the term. And actually, a number of experts on the Soviet Gulag, they agreed with us. They read the book and they said, actually, it's totally legitimate to use the term.
It's important for the audience to understand that actually the detainees coming out looking emaciated or never coming out at all, their minds are broken, bodies are broken, that is part of the system itself. It is an important part of how the system operates, that there is a proportion of people that leave and bear witness to what happens within the walls of the prisons.
Absolutely. And I dare you to find a Syrian family who does not have at least one detainee in the family. I mean, I coordinated a project called the Syrian Oral History Project, in which I kind of randomly interviewed Syrian refugees about their experiences in the conflict. And without me even starting the conversation, without me broaching the subject, these people would start talking about the prison system by themselves. Either they had an uncle in prison, or they had been arrested for some infraction, or because somebody denounced them, or because they were in the wrong place in the wrong time. And through these random interviews, already I had the idea this is a system that has an impact on the society, that is to mold the society in a particular image, and not simply for crime and punishment.
Well, we'd definitely want to get onto that whole social project, but I just want to pick up on something else first, which was that process, the research process you've mentioned twice now. That's a huge amount of people that you interviewed, and for this project and other projects, and their experiences are so terrible. that there's a real risk there of re-traumatization for everybody. And Jabber himself, the co-author, has been in prison. He wrote a harrowing essay for New Lines, and I recommend you read it. It's fantastic because it covers so much of his experience, including those moments of redemption, the comradeship you get in those terrible conditions. And so for him interviewing 100 people who've been through the same process, I thought that sounded pretty terrible potentially. And I wondered how you navigated the ethics of trying to protect people from this past, how you tried to navigate the process of something that is so potentially upsetting.
No, that's a very good question, of course, and that was also continuously on our mind. I mean, in a nutshell, the interviews that we did, of course, they had informed consent. We told people exactly what we're going to do with these interviews. It was up to them to decide how they would like to be quoted in the book, and you can see in the book, also in the footnotes, that some interviewees are mentioned name, last name, fully identifiable, and again, others only with initials, and again, others with none. And this is because this was voluntaristic. It's based on their will. And so re-traumatization, of course, requires that you think of aftercare. So you don't just go in, do a long, debilitating interview with someone for 3 hours, and then you leave, never to see them again. That's not the way to do it, of course. These 100 people that Jabber interviewed, for example, are in a way also his natural network. He knows these people. Some of them he knows well. Some of them he did time with. So we are kind of fundamentally embedded, really. Also in my daily life, for example, here in Europe, Amsterdam, Berlin, Istanbul, these cities where I travel a lot, former detainees are kind of a natural environment for us in many ways. We stay in touch with these people. We also try to help them out with concerns they have in their lives, for example. And that can be anything from trauma care. We have referred a number of people also to trauma center here in Amsterdam. Some wanted to, and others didn't. Or, for example, the broken education that people have. Right? Somebody was an undergraduate student at Damascus University at the age of 23, was arrested, disappeared for 7 years, then came out with no diploma and with a major stigma in Syrian society. Couldn't finish his degree. But that person then flees in 2015 to Europe, and he has nothing. So, one of the main concerns of a person, of a survivor like that, is to pick up his education again so he can build his future, and to not only his trauma. So these things, we listen to people, we listen to their concerns as well. What is it that they need? And to the best of our abilities, we try to help them out with that as well.
And so you've already mentioned that this subject comes up spontaneously when you've been talking to other people. And I wondered actually if the flip side of that trauma is actually that they are using those terrible experiences, that it was for something. If they're telling you and bearing witness, and you are doing something with that which is going out into the world, then there was somehow a point that it wasn't for nothing that they went through all of that. Did you ever get a sense that there was some kind of positive aspect for people?
I mean, ironically, yes. A number of detainees said that, including Jabber himself in 2 interviews. He said that, of course, in hindsight, it was terrible that he was in one of the worst prisons in the world. The violence, the threats, the isolation, and then the sense of stigma after being released are, of course, terrible things that fundamentally disrupted his life. But he will also say, and he said in a number of interviews, that in a way the prison also enriched him. So he built comradeship in prison that it goes beyond, for example, like familial relations even. So it can be closer to someone that you serve time with in prison than, for example, your own sibling. Or the fact that Jabber, he learned English in prison. To give an example, before he didn't know that. It counts for a number of other, like the Syrian intellectual Yasir Haj-Saleh, who wrote about his experiences in prison in Palmyra. He said the same thing. He said he learned English, and when you speak with him, he's absolutely fluent. So So there are, of course, things that prison takes from you, but also gives to you. And then, of course, the fact that, the deluge is that after 2000, let's say 13, 2015, especially when thousands of former detainees, when they flee abroad, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, of course, but also to Europe. There are almost 1 million Syrians in Germany. So the 1 out of 80 Germans is Syrian. All of these people, they finally have an environment where they can speak openly about their experiences, they can publish about them, they can get treatment if they wish, and they no longer feel isolated. Because the worst thing a lot of detainees said was not the fact that they were randomly arrested or cruelly treated by the intelligence agencies, disappeared without their family knowing anything, but the fact that when they came out, they felt so lonely. They felt that nobody understood them, and nobody even sometimes didn't. Nobody believed them, or nobody wanted to be friends with them. They couldn't get a job. So the profound sense of isolation after being freed, they often experience as a double victimization. And that, for example, can be lifted in Europe. That's the interesting thing.
Uğur, I wanted to go back to something you said about the effect on Syrian society. This was something I was talking to our colleague Karim Shaheen, who reported from Syria. And he was telling me that at one point, 5% of Syria's pre-war population had been detained, which is something like 1.2 million people, which is designed, as we were saying earlier, to cow people into submission. What effect does that incarceration have on the society writ large?
Apologies, I have a rowdy cat here in the house. The effect on society hasn't even been properly studied yet, to be honest. I mean, this book is on Syrian Gulag is on detainees and their experiences, but there should actually be a sequel to this book that should discuss the impact, the long-term impact also that it had on society. To give you an example, the intergenerational impact that it had. So, and the best way to explain this is through individual kind of examples. So we interviewed a man who was from the western city of Latakia, who was actually from an Alawite minority, which is as you know, is the kind of the ethno-religious background, the Assad family itself. And this was a family that was gray people, as they say. So neither with the regime, but also not with the opposition, trying to survive. And at some point, the gentleman who was roughly my age, around 40, his uncle, went to a bar and he had a couple of drinks. And at some point he said something, or he blurted out something critical about Hafiz Assad. Now that, of course, that's a mortal sin. He left the bar and walked home. And before he even made it home, the intelligence already pulled up their white Renault and shoved him into the trunk, took him to the branch in the middle of the night, and they tortured him there. He disappeared for 6 years. Now, this gentleman who's my age, who's an acquaintance of mine, said that this was one of the worst experiences of his life, because the uncle who disappeared was his favorite uncle. He was funny. He cared about my friend's grades. He asked about his friends and how he was doing, who would play football with him. And all of a sudden, kind of an important, almost father figure in your life just disappears. And nobody gives you any answers. You can't ask any questions. And so this has a profound, kind of debilitating experience on his, for example, on his academic performance, because he felt that there was no uncle anymore to ask him, how was school? Would you like to go to a football game with me? So that intergenerational trauma really had a profound impact on Syrian society. And the impact that we see now, and is even more interesting in many ways. During one of the interviews that we did, we always kind of preambles of the interviews that we sit down, often in someone's living room, and we have a cup of coffee. And I was having coffee with this survivor, and then his son walked into the room, and his son was about 4 years old. And we were talking about, in Arabic, Syria, we use the term Syria, and he came up and he said to his father, Baba, what is Syria? And his father said, what am I supposed to say to this kid? Well, he's 4 years old. He knows that we speak Arabic in the house and that we're from a country called Syria. But what am I supposed to tell him? That we have a dictator who used chemical weapons on his own people, who threw hundreds of thousands of his own citizens into prison and tortured them. How do you explain this to these children, to that generation, who grow up in Europe in an environment where it's normal to ask these type of questions, and also in an environment where in Germany or in the Netherlands, for example, the horrors of the Second World War are spoken about openly. I mean, Dutch kids, for example, they learn about Anne Frank when they're 7 years old. But what about these kids? What about these new Syrian Europeans? How are they supposed to relate to that, to the suffering and to the victimization of their parents' generation?
I want to turn to the audience, so we don't have that much more time with Uğur, so I want to hear if you have any questions. We will have a sort of shorter second panel after this, so you'll get a chance to ask further questions. But for Uğur, if anybody has any questions now, who can we get to rove around with the mic? Tam?
Hi, I'm Nick Vortek. I guess my question is really about how the Syrian government's strategy toward and treatment of detainees changed after 2011. So you mentioned with Yassin al-Saleh that there's been a long tradition of both torture and detainment in the Syrian prison system going back to the 70s and 80s, and I'm sort of wondering about how the strategy of the state changed after 2011, or if it did, or if it was simply a kind of continuation of pre-existing practices.
Good, thank you. Did everybody hear that question? Is that clear? Yeah, okay. Anything else before we go back?
Yes, there was one over here. Tam, behind you.
Hi, yes. Is that working? Yes. I'm Liz Sly. I would like to ask two questions, if I may. One is I covered the Syrian Revolution, and I interviewed many people at the time, 11, 12, 13, who had been caught up in those mass waves of arrests after protests and things like that, taken to prison, tortured, maybe held a few weeks, a few months, and then they did go before court. And some of them were released. I mean, they were released because I spoke to them. I mean, partly why I know their stories. And I sort of said, how did you get out? How were you released? Because there were so many people who disappeared completely or were held long term as well. And they said I had an honest judge, and there seemed to be this phenomenon of an honest judge. And I always wanted to find an honest judge and do a story about an honest judge and find one of these judges who said, yes, I can tell you were tortured and these charges are ridiculous and I'm dismissing the charges and you're released. Did you come across this phenomenon? And are there really honest judges, or is there something else at play here?
Thank you. Uğur, do you want to start with the change in the regime's behavior post-2011?
Yes. So, I mean, and as you well know, the regime didn't really count on these mass uprisings to happen in Syria. There's this famous, ironic interview with President Assad in January 2011, in which he says that Syria is stable in the Arab Spring or whatever is going on in Egypt and Tunisia is irrelevant for us because we have a stable society. Now, and after 2011, two things happened. One is, of course, the scale of the imprisonment went up exponentially because before that you had a number of people getting together, relatively senior men and women who were in the opposition, intellectual conversations about Marxism, or you had circles of kind of political Islam who got together, and there were a few dozen people that would be arrested. They really knew exactly what they were doing. They were put in prison, and then later some of them published memoirs. But when you have tens of thousands, and in some cases 100,000 people demonstrating in the main squares of the country, which by the summer of 2011 was the case, and in some cities like Homs and Hama even earlier, then technically you have to arrest all of those people that you get in your hands. And so what happens is, first of all, the scale goes up, and we know that from detainees who happened to be in prison in 2011. And so that's people like Jabir, for example, who were arrested before 2011 on spurious charges, of course, and who happened to be in prison and who saw all of a sudden this incredible influx of mostly young people, young middle class students, ordinary people, shopkeepers, who were arrested and put in prison because they got caught at a demonstration. So the overcrowding in these prisons and the workload, let's say in between quotation marks, the workload of the intelligence agencies went up massively, which frustrated them in many ways, which led to even more violence. And second, after 2011, and especially after July 2012, when the regime kind of split into the hawks and those people who wanted to make a deal, you see a radicalization of violence. So, of course, before 2011, there was violence as well. And in fact, one of our interviewees said in 2017 when we interviewed him, such a miserable period. I wish we could go back to normal before 2011. And of course, it wasn't normal back then either. There was torture and there was, extrajudicial executions, and the country has a long history of violence. But what happened is a fundamental radicalization on part of the perpetrating agencies of the regime, which is, of course, the intelligence agencies, the four main intelligence agencies, which are the Shabiha militias and irregular paramilitaries, ordinary people in the street who were armed and giving fiats to arrest people. And third, of course, the special forces, such as the 4th Armored Division, the Republican Guard, who also had the right to arrest.
Was there a sense around that time that the regime was losing control with this many people now on the streets, huge influx of people into prisons?
Initially, yes, but more importantly, from what we know, of course, the regime, the Assad regime in essence is unresearchable. It's a bit like Kremlinology. It's any guess is good, unless you have really good inside information. But what we know then is, yes, overwhelmed on the one hand, and on the other hand also, there were seriously a number of people who realized you can't put 100,000 people in prison. This is a mass uprising that cannot be. It's not intelligent to repress and to use what they called Hal Emni, so the security solution. But those people were very quickly pushed out, and in the radicalization of the hawks in the regime, such as Maher Assad, brother of Bashar al-Assad, and a number of other quite important intelligence bosses, Ali Mamlouk, Jamil al-Hassan, the infamous people. Because of their radicalization, they escalated the levels of violence in the prison. So, for example, torturing to death became a really normal thing, which most detainees before 2011 say, yeah, there was torture, but it was kind of, it was routine, and it wasn't to kill people. People are not executed through torture. But those are the two major changes.
And then what did you think of Liz's question about the honest judges?
Yeah, I'm intrigued.
Is that something you came across?
There are a number of people that we interviewed, for example, in all of our interviews, who could pinpoint one honest person in the regime, right? So there's one police officer who didn't beat me that hard. There was one intelligence officer who could arrest me, but he didn't, so he neglected to. And of course, there are always these individuals, but when it comes to the judges, one of the major changes was the fact that the regime established the terrorism court, Mahkamat al-Irhab. And the terrorism court meant that anybody demonstrating against the regime is a terrorist. Actually, any form of dissent is terrorism. The regime jumped on this war on terror bandwagon. And a number of lawyers that we interviewed who defended detainees in the terrorism court, their stories were absolutely fascinating. For example, one gentleman from Selamiya was a lawyer in Damascus until fairly recently even. He held the regime basically to its own standards. And the regime says, we arrest you, there's a terrorism court, we try you there, and if you're guilty, then we convict you. So he goes to defend the detainees, and it can be a random detainee that's then assigned to him. Already upon entering the building, this lawyer gets beaten up for defending the terrorists. Not to mention that on the few times that he does make it into the building, and he goes actually to the court, and he sees these emaciated, destroyed personalities, or the shadow of the individual that's still left, the lawyer sees some really bizarre situations, such as an officer, mid-level officer of the intelligence agency walks in and walks straight into the judge's room and the judge stands to attention to the intelligence officer. So that's a bizarre, this is not rule of law, this is rule by law. And so exceptions are there, of course, but for every honest judge, I could point you out at least 100 violent and corrupt ones.
Okay, I think we will leave it at that, or with your permission, because we have another panelist we want to get to and some wider questions we want to discuss with the audience. So for now, I'll thank you, Uğur Üngör, for joining us from Amsterdam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just give us a moment, audience. We need to regroup, and then we will have another guest joining us, Emma Beals. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to do a second panel now, and this is a chance, obviously, to talk a bit about what Uğur was discussing, but also to talk about some of the wider issues as it pertains to Syria and to some other countries. To do this, we have with us Emma Beals. Emma is a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute, and she's the former editor of Syria in Context, is now an independent consultant focused on Syria and on conflict. Emma, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Oh yeah, I thought we would start with Liz's question, the second question, which was about how do you keep something like Syria, which has gone on now 12 years, how do you keep it in the public eye?
Excellent question. I think I'll bring it back to the subject. How do you keep not just Syria, but the issues of detention, of the security state, of the unreformed Assad regime, which is still at the heart of all of it, and I think is being lost even in some of the coverage that is getting through. There's not so much these days, but it's all about normalization and this and that. And so actually a lot of these core issues, which were conflict drivers, which are the reason people are displaced, the reason they're not going back, gets lost in the reporting, even when you do see articles about refugee return or normalization or whatever. And I think things like the book that's just come out, the report this week from the Sednaya Detainees and Missing Persons and Families Association, which was a very, very detailed, diligent reporting on Tishreen Military Hospital, and they've done other reports as well. There is actually now this really, really diligent research coming out. I think massacres is another huge one. Obviously, the Tadamon massacre. That wasn't the only massacre in Tadamon. It wasn't and Tadamon is certainly not the only area that there were a large number of massacres. There is a whole lot of work going on with civil society to try and diligently report these, to put the pieces together, to try and understand actually what happened. I don't think we understand nearly enough about the scale of the massacres as well as the detentions, right? And as we heard earlier, though, the people who were massacred are considered as part of the disappeared or the missing. So we have this kind of nebulous number of people that are quote unquote missing. Some of them are in prison, some of them were executed, some of them were massacred and so forth. So there hasn't actually been enough surfacing of some of that, which I think is now starting to be done, but it's not necessarily making it into the media. So we have this new information, we have new insights. I think also trying to cover how the detentions in the security apparatus relates to all other policy areas is something super important.
Explain that a bit more.
Yeah, so it is the central issue to my mind as someone who's been working on Syria for a very, very long time. When you're talking about normalization, when you're talking about refugee return, when you're talking about what's happening with the UN aid supply in Syria, or actually what's at the heart of it is always the state's relationship and violence towards the population. That's why there are 3 territories. That's why there are armed groups. That's why there are refugees. That's why we have a political process. So making sure that is understood, I think there's a perception, particularly with this issue of detainees and the missing and the gulags and everything that goes with it, that this is somehow a historical issue, that there is this list of people who vanished sometime around 2011, and now we just have to count them or find them, and that's sort of a yesterday problem. It's not. People are going missing today. It's more they're being arrested for putting things on Facebook. When we talk about the Spider protests, there's been people protesting all over the country in different ways, some of it more indirect or smaller, and those people are being arrested. So continuing to always make sure that this issue is referenced in relation to those other policy areas, or trying to get people to cover all issues in Syria where they actually do talk about this and talk about the new trends in it, because I think there was a question about the strategy of the regime, and it has changed throughout the conflict, and it's changing again now, and that's not particularly well covered either. So there's a whole lot of stuff that hasn't been covered that is new, that can be surfaced, and I don't think we're seeing it surfaced because there's obviously only so many column inches. But
isn't that part of the problem, is that after Sweden protests are a good example, because after so many years, when a new outbreak breaks out, like in Sweden at the moment, it's very difficult for the media to know what to do with that story. Like you see that they are trying to explain it in the context of, is this a return to 2011? But it feels like you're just rehashing some of this new piece of information come to light, but all you can do is just retell the story in the ways that you have in the past.
Yeah. I mean, but this is why I think some of it, isn't just about the daily news grind of that there's a protest today, there's a protest yesterday, and I think, I was doing journalism earlier in the conflict, and then I stopped, and that was exactly one of my frustrations, right? There's only so many times you can write about, like, this town is going to be besieged, and by the time you've written the 6th story on that in 12 months, you sort of think, crikey, is this actually helping, and is this what I want to be doing with my time? But that more diligent investigation, like the story of Sweden is very interesting. Like, why is it unique in Syria compared to other areas? But it's also not just Sweden that's protesting. I think there's a perception that that's the only part of the regime-controlled areas that is involved in some sort of new dynamic vis-a-vis their relationship to the state, and I don't think that that's necessarily true either. It's just the most obvious.
So to answer Liz's question then, are you saying that we need to just dig deeper into these stories that on the surface look like 2011 potentially, and 12 and 13, and find out the new dynamics? Do you think that counts as news? Because actually I was wondering if it's less about the cyclical nature of it and more about the emotional nature of it, which is hopelessness. People are now thinking nothing changes and there's nothing we can do. Journalism doesn't make a difference. Journalism, and you've just said, do I really want to spend my life doing this when you've written the same story 6 times? Is there a feeling of just being ground down by an ongoing conflict, which makes you think, I don't really know what to do now. I don't know what to do different to make any kind of difference. Do you think that's kind of combatable as well?
Well, I think that's one of the problems with the environment around Syria now in all aspects, right? So whether it's like individual countries' relationship or engagement on the file, whether it's the political actors, the negotiators, the Office of the Special Envoy, whether it's the political opposition or Arab states, I think most people have got to that point of exhaustion, right? Which is why you saw the Arab League trying to normalize and sort of saying, we don't know what else to do, maybe we'll try this. And I think, probably media has got to the same point. I know analysts and researchers all have, everyone's kind of got to, or not everyone, but a lot of people have got to that point where they, are feeling like, well, nothing we do is changing. And particularly when you see the political environment going backwards from a rights-based or justice perspective, right? It's going backwards quite rapidly. It makes it feel even more hopeless. But in terms of the hopelessness people in Syria are feeling, I think that's being exacerbated. And I think that we've seen multiple social shocks in regime areas since the quote-unquote end of the violence, so the end of the breaking of the sieges and the forced displacement of those areas, which will obviously happen militarily. But once people in regime areas were expecting some sort of quote-unquote peace dividend, right? So they were expecting things to get better from that point, and it hasn't. So you had the economic crisis, which was exacerbated by Lebanon. Then you had COVID. The regime was hiding the numbers, wasn't helping everybody, so that was another social shock. You had the earthquake, and now you're seeing, people are seeing that after 6 months of the general license, the wavering of sanctions from the US and so on, there was no payback for the populations. This narrative the regime has spun didn't come to anything when that was actually lifted as a pressure. The Arab League thing happened, and then there was no payoff from that. So you've just seen one thing after another that has further eroded from the population that previously were still somewhat on board with the regime in terms of that hopelessness, right? Which is why you're seeing people leaving, it's why you're seeing people protesting, it's why you're seeing videos even in Sweden of people who previously, or elsewhere in the country, who previously have supported the regime now saying, enough's enough, they've got to go. And that rhetoric is really increasing, and I think that is new. It's not 2011, but it's new, you know?
I want to keep going with this media question, but I want to bring the audience in because I want to do this panel, this part as a little bit more of a kind of salon. So, Tam, do you have do you guys, I mean, one of the nice things about the kind of crowd that comes to these events is that a lot of you are knowledgeable about this topic. But also you're kind of a different age group. So I wonder if some of you have been following the Syria story only recently, and you felt like maybe you've come in the middle of it. It's going on so long, 12 years. And then maybe people have been following it for a while. Perhaps do you think that you're getting to the end of your appetite for it, that it just repeats over and over again? Should we have some thoughts from the audience? Hands up. Tam, do you have the thing? Yeah, the man at the front in the green. Sure.
My name is Mohammed, postgrad student at LSE. I just wanted
Hold it a bit closer to them.
Wanted to ask, the Assad clan managed to evade scrutiny like before 2011. There's no accountability for their crimes, despite the massacres in Tidmouth prison and in Hama. My question is, like, how did the Assad regime and his family integrate themselves in British and European society, despite their massacres? There was no accountability, no acknowledgement of Tidmouth and Hama, and Rifat was in Paris, just chilling there for decades. So
Good. Other comments? The lady here, and then I think Sia as well, yeah.
My name is Zara, and I just finished my postgrad at LSE. And my dissertation was looking a bit into European Union's external migration policies, so to do with Middle East and Asia. And I kind of wanted to ask, but also comment on the fact that even EU's policies regarding refugees and migrants are moving away from the discussion a little bit, from the discussion of Syrian refugees. It's also about Ukrainian refugees. It's mostly about return and reintegration of irregular migrants in Europe, so the heavy focus on securitization of Europe. So I wonder if that is also connected to the fact that we're feeling a bit disconnected from what's going on in Syria at the moment, and the continuation is not even in the public policy area is
yeah, this might be something you can speak to because you follow the public policy closely. Do you want to start with the European angle or perhaps the British angle? Because the Brits, I mean, the question, as Mohammed, did you ask? Yeah, the question Mohammed asked, I think, is very intriguing because some of you will remember the Rose of Damascus story about Asma al-Assad, the wife of President Bashar, which was, I think, it came out in Vogue, March 2011. And that wasn't the first time. I mean, Assad had been on stage with Blair. There was this kind of push for normalization when the early 2000s, pre the war. But of course, as you were pointing out, like the regime had been known to be like this since the days of Hafez. Why do you think that normalization process continued for so long?
I couldn't tell you. I mean, Asma al-Assad has not been stripped of her citizenship, which, if you want to get into a whole conversation about who's being stripped of their citizenship for their activities in Syria, seems like a catastrophic double standard from where I'm sitting. I think some others, there was a hope that they could kind of be interlocutors. So your Samir Fawzes and so forth, the delay in the sanctioning of Samir Fawz at least was very much from a hope that he could play some sort of intermediary role, which never sort of came to fruition. And I think there's some other characters that have been knocking around where there has been a hope or perception that may be the case, but
never seems to have worked out well.
It hasn't gone great.
Yeah. And then what about the question from Lydia about the European policy? Because there is also this, I mean, we were talking about media fatigue, but there's also kind of policy fatigue.
It's just fatigue, yeah. And I think that there is I would call it kind of a strange paradox in some of the policies. Like everyone has pulled back toward, they want to talk about accountability. Oh, look, we're doing these nice things. We're funding these court cases. We're funding the AAA, and we care so much about accountability. But we are going to talk about externalization of our refugee policy. We are not going to go and slap people around too much much when they are doing what are obviously not particularly voluntary returns of refugees, and so when we talk about accountability in a wee bit, what I sort of always try and push in those conversations is the need for like a holistic view of what is accountability. And I think when you talk to most Syrians, they have the same view of it, right? Like you cannot on the one hand be talking in a great game about your support for universal jurisdiction cases and sort of regional courts in Germany, which is wonderful that is happening, whilst at the same hand, the victims of those same crimes are living in tents in the Bekaa, consistently worried that they're going to be forcibly returned. That is not accountability to those families and to the victims of those crimes, particularly when a lot of them are related to or have direct sort of suffering from those same things. So I think, there is not just a fatigue, but there's also been a withdrawing to what's seen as achievable in the policy aims, which then creates these very obvious sort of paradoxes and schisms, where on the one hand, everyone's tired of the refugee issue, we'll just sort of shut up about that, but on the same hand, we'll really celebrate this idea of a very narrow perception of criminal justice and accountability, without really linking the fact that those two things are one and the same. And I do think it is kind of adding to the problem that we're seeing, right? No one's sort of throwing themselves in front of a bus to protect the nice family in the Bekaa who are feeling super vulnerable at the moment.
One more question about fatigue, because you were in, I think you were in New York recently listening in on these conversations about policy and so on, and I wondered what the report was. Do these people think about these policies as something that could be implemented anytime soon, or is it more an aspiration?
Policies?
The policies of European and Western countries, the Americans, towards Syria.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that there isn't really any concrete line of effort occurring at this time that would resolve this Syrian conflicts. And I think that is the problem that we face, right? Everyone sort of 2254 has become a bit of a fig leaf. There's a couple of lines of activity under that are not actually active activity. They are, conceptual pretty much at this point. And there isn't, the Arab League conversations have pretty much ground to a halt for the same reasons that other lines of effort have ground to a halt, which is regime intransigence, which brings us back to the former point of the core issue here. And so I think in terms of how do people feel about implementing these policies, where, how,
where, when,
what,
through what mechanism,
there isn't.
That was something that you and I were talking about in terms of what it actually might mean, because the regime is so intransigent, nobody has any relationships with with the Assad regime anymore. So how might it actually? Yeah, well, you can ask. I mean, how might it actually translate into action if nobody has any relationship with the Assad regime, and even the normalization that is happening with the Arab countries is very limited in terms of the scope of that policy, of that normalization is relatively limited to drugs and some refugees and things like that.
But I think even there, their argument has been, how could we move this forward if we don't have a relationship? So we need to rebuild the relationship, but that hasn't come to fruition either. It's been met with the same levels of intransigence, and I would argue it is in part because they gave the cart away before the horse, or the horse, they come back to the party and the big celebration and the handshakes and all of the legitimacy and legitimization building that he got from that process. I mean, none of the sort of symbolism and whatnot from him arriving in these capitals in red carpets and drums and whatnot wasn't lost on anybody, including him. So why would he then go and sit in the little working group about Captagon and actually be constructive in it? He already got a lot of what he was hoping for from these processes, I would argue, already.
Yeah.
And then they're finding that having a relationship with him is of limited value in and of itself. And then I guess it's because you're talking about who is him, who can actually move, which brings us back to the point of Iran and other actors involved. I don't think it is as simple as one person in the regime deciding X or Y is going to happen and I'm going to sit in a meeting and shake a hand. It's actually much more complex when it comes to any kind of implementation, even if there was desire from the top, which I don't think there is.
Well, I was just going to throw it open to the room again, actually, but I was going to start by, because I know there is expertise in the room. Again, I'm sure, Liz, you have your own answers to your own question, but in terms of what we're all trying to do in keeping the discussion going with some hope in the future, I wondered if we could think about the different genres of writing, because we've had this very academic book presented to us. The research is meticulous and harrowing, and I do recommend it to everybody. And there's also, we've had Dima Wanous on one of our panels before. I think a lot of you were here. She wrote The Frightened Ones, Al-Khaifun, and documenting exactly the same kind of fear in Assad Syria through literature, gets to a whole different audience. We've published Mustafa Khalifa, who wrote Al-Qawqa'a, classic prison literature. Yassin Al-Haj Saleh is a New Lines writer that's already come up in the earlier panel. At the back, we have Sara Ashfar, who made, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the documentary, They Disappeared. So documentaries, again, are another way of getting to another audience or another chance to raise it again. So we can think of different stories, but we can also think of different ways of getting the message out. And I know, Sara, your work, do you mind that I'm drawing on very specific knowledge I have?
Yeah.
You're working on something new, right? Tam, would you? Yes.
Yeah, I made the documentary series Disappeared for Channel 4 in 2017. I just really wanted to say about the authors of this book, the fact that they interviewed 150 survivors is just incredible, because, you know, we did a handful of interviews with survivors, and it was really hard. It was really hard for them and hard for us, and really since then I haven't been able to do another interview like that, because it really takes its toll, not because it takes its toll on me, but because you can see what's happening to the person when you're interviewing them. And, you know, like with the book, everybody wanted to be interviewed and gave their consent, but you do something and then nothing happens. You know, it gets out into the world, it's documented, there's testimony, but, you know, this issue has not moved forward. My frustration, you know, with the documentary is that I felt like a lot of people watching it were already in the human rights space and community, and I do think that with Syria now, it's impossible really to get it into the news media. Even the Sweda thing, it took a month, like, for Newsnight to do a piece on the protests. But, you know, there has to be some way of getting this story and the narrative across kind of to the general public. So anyway, I hope kind of the play will try to look at things from a different angle and hopefully might get coverage, because it's not a news piece and it's, you know, using the arts.
Well, and you can put it back into the news cycle, can't you, with arts, because people then review it.
Yeah, I think that was...
It's another way of kind of inserting it in a different way.
Yeah, I think that touches on the point you were making, that actually you have to find different ways of telling the same story again and again, and maybe the arts way is a good way. Let's take some more questions from the audience. I want to start with the gentleman there, and then who else? Oh, there, yeah.
Hi, Felix Pope. I just wanted to ask, you talked a little about the recent protests in Syria, and I was just sort of wondering, I mean, you know, it seems remarkable to me, given what we know about the gulags, the repression, the disappearances, that there are any protests still going on. And I know Sweden is a bit of a special case, although I understand that there are protests more widely, perhaps to a lesser extent. I'm just wondering what any of you think about the state of civil society in Syria at the moment, after 12 years, and sort of the potential going forward for more dissent, for protests. You know, what do you see as the future in that respect?
Very good, thank you.
Just to plug Syrian civil society, I would say that in the effort to try to get justice or to find information about the detainees and the missing, which they've successfully done through a massive advocacy campaign, and have got this UN resolution to be able to set up an institute for to find the fate and whereabouts of the missing in Syria. They have been really, really good at doing a big solidarity campaign with all of the different families groups around the world who are looking for missing people. And so in terms of Syrian civil society's ability to try and to acknowledge the fact that this is not just them facing this, and that actually moving this issue forward for them should be done in a way that moves that issue forward for everyone, I think has been really amazing to watch and super important. And you know, they at least are acknowledging that they are not the only ones sort of facing these kind of crises. The state of civil society in Syria after 12 years, funding is being cut for journalism and for all sorts of things, and so again it comes to these paradoxes, right? Like we really want these wonderful outcomes, but no one's prepared to consistently fund people to do that work. I think in terms of in regime areas, there's been a crackdown on civil society. You've seen it with the expansion of the Cybercrimes Act, which has resulted in people being sort of arrested for Facebook posts or like moderate criticism about electricity policy from a technical expert and things like this. And sort of part of the consolidation of Asma and her empire has also seen a crackdown on some of the civil society. Ironically, I was talking to people in Damascus a few months ago who were saying that actually some of the only civil society that could speak freely or relatively freely without massive concerns and wasn't sort of reporting that their space was closing around them was the civil society from Swaida. And it will be really interesting to see how they fare over the sort of coming months, and whether the regime will take that as like allowing a little bit of civic space, which they have done for Swaida because they had sort of different ambitions, whether that is seen to have backfired and therefore be something that they will crack down more broadly, because they're also cracking down on civil society on the coastal regions at the moment as well, and in Damascus, and regime aligned or regime supported civil society projects have seen people being arrested and detained as well. So it's close. It's actually getting smaller. If that was even possible, I think certainly in regime areas.
But that's what does make it, you said you can't believe they're still protesting, and that's kind of what I feel all the time, just the bravery of these people in the face of it all.
Should we have the last few questions then? People in the audience, who have we got? Start with our brother with the scarf.
So, Jonathan Spire, my name is. I have a very specific question to Emma, really. People have talked about Swaida, and the other kind of story that to some degree has surfaced regarding Syria over the last month has been events in southern Deir ez-Zor, and this clashes between armed tribal elements and the SDF forces, and two very specific kind of takes on that have emerged insofar as it's been covered. One from the kind of pro-SDF and SDF authorities themselves, who are saying, well, this is a uprising because the regime and Iran have been providing weaponry to people in southern Deir ez-Zor. And then another version has been, well, no, that's an excuse, and actually there's some very real issues here between the tribes in southern Deir ez-Zor and the American-supported SDF authorities. So I'm just interested in your take on that, and whether you, I know you speak very closely to people on the ground, what you've heard about that or what you would have to say about that.
That's very interesting. And then the lady, I think, in the leather jacket.
Hi, hello. This was more a general question, because we talked about kind of how we can make Syria relevant and how can we interest people. But yet at the same time, we kind of refer to it with European historical terms like the gulags, or we, compare genocides, or we compare massacres with our own history that we all know and we all, are very familiar with. We studied it at school. So isn't there somewhere in that already we're imposing a sort of historical aspect to something that's happening now?
Okay, very good. Well, why don't you start, Emma, with the SDF question, because that was very specific, I think.
I, to be honest, haven't been following it in great detail, but the two sides of the debate, as you summarize them, both have an element of truth to them, as in most of those things, right? So I don't feel particularly qualified to give you an authoritative take on that.
But I think part of the difficulty, and this is what we've been talking about with Syria, is that sometimes we focus on it as if it is just one conflict and there's only a handful of players. There's the regime and there's the people on the ground. But actually, as the gentleman is pointing out, I mean, you have lots of other people playing a role in eastern Syria, the Americans, of course, supporting the SDF and so on. That makes it much harder to find a conclusion to the things we've been talking about. I wonder if you think that, per our colleague in the blue, that the complexity itself means that some countries just don't want to pay attention to it, that they feel like it's so complicated that we'd rather just leave it to the side and worry about our bigger things like Ukraine, like Iran, like Russia, things like that. Has that been your experience?
Yes. And not just that it's complicated, but that some of the complexities are so politically fraught that picking them up is just in the too hard basket, right? Like the autonomous administration, SDF, whatever, the various Kurdish representations are not represented in the Geneva talks, for example. So you have a whole territory of the country controlled by a relatively clearly consolidated governing power and an armed group with backing by the Americans who are not represented in the political talks because of there's just one example. There's multiple examples like that across the country where it's not just that it's all complex. It's just that each individual one of those problems is so politically fraught that it just goes in nobody wants to expend political capital on unpacking that whole issue with Turkey when also Turkey's the buffer between Ukraine and the West, and there's this Black Sea thing, and there's cross-border and and so people just go,
they retreat into the big geopolitics that really matter to those particular countries.
Or to the simple components of it, right? So people are treating symptoms, not the disease, constantly.
And is that related
the symptoms are simpler?
Yeah, and is that related to what the lady was asking? That sometimes we tend to look at these conflicts not as they are to the people on the ground, but as they are to the structures and intellectual ideas that make sense to us.
Well, yeah, I think particularly if you're trying to explain it to a foreign audience, I mean, a gulag is something that makes sense. That seems to be a relatively a natural thing. And I think on the issue of detentions and so on, the problem with detentions and missing people is it's a horror that's totally unique, and it's really difficult to explain these concepts, even with literature, even with plays and poems. You know, these are visceral, awful things that are all consuming. It's I would argue, in some ways worse than someone being executed or whatever, which is a crime and is horrible in its own right, but has a sort of more simple sort of architecture, I guess, of grief and justice and so on around it, that we do revert to whatever clumsy language or concepts we have to even attempt to make that make sense to somebody where you're trying to get them to give a shit about all these people who's people, you hear gulag and you immediately think of something very, very awful, and you wouldn't necessarily if you used a word or a way of explaining it from a local context. But I do think that then is problematic, right? Particularly when you're talking to policymakers who waffle in, on their 2-year sort of mission, and they look at things, and particularly now that people aren't staying as long, they're not as invested. They don't have the political capital from mandates from their capitals to actually act in the same way, that they do come in and they think, oh, this is just like when I did Nexus programming in wherever it was. I came from Colombia, and it's I need to do livelihoods for the ladies. And you're like, oh, hang on a minute, like back up. And so the people are just shoving all of these like very bureaucratic, normative, rote sort of processes that they do in their little policy jobs in all of these places onto something that is deeply complex. And that is really, really, really problematic, particularly when you have, we talked about people revisiting their trauma, and then you have to roll everybody in their trauma out every time the new people come in every 2 years and be here are the sad people again. And it's not fair.
That's certainly something that we saw. I mean, those who were watching the Arab Spring at the beginning, that there was a tendency to put it in a certain intellectual framework that had come before. And
lots of springs.
Yeah, and very hard to see it as something different in Middle Eastern history. We've overrun by time, so I think we will draw it to a close there, if it's okay with you. My thanks to Emma Beals. Thank you all for coming out today. I know there was going to be a tube strike, but it didn't happen in the end, so thank you all for coming. Anyway, we'll stay around for a bit of conversation. If you want, join us downstairs. The book we are talking about, Syrian Gulag, Inside Assad's Prison System, is out now. The co-author of the book, Uğur, who was on the Zoom with us, will be hosted by us in Washington, D.C. at the end of this month for a similar conversation. So if you are in D.C. later in October and you want to check that out, you'll find the details on our Instagram. You can also find the essay that we wrote, that Jabber wrote for the magazine. It's called How I Survived a Syrian Gulag. It's on our website. In the meantime, thank you to Jabber, who didn't make it. Thank you to Uğur for joining us. Thank you to Emma. Thank you to Lydia Wilson. Thank you for the whole magazine team who just supported us. And thank you for all of you for attending.
Thank you, Faisal.
You were here early. I thought you've had a long time to think about it. You were downstairs in the bar, you were hungry. That was the get-up. It's already been asked. Can't be sure. Today I brought my jacket.